Hey everyone, welcome to today's lecture on interstate conflict. So continuing on our conflict theme, and then next class we'll look at a specific interstate conflict to go into a little bit more detail and to kind of give a problematic example or a complex example. So what are interstate wars? Those are wars that are mainly take place within the recognized territories of a state. So it's within a particular state. So remember, interstate wars, which we've talked about in the past, take place between multiple states. These are ones that are confined within the territory of a particular state. And we have multiple different categories. So for civil wars, which are wars that take place between a central government and a non-state actor. So there's some form of rebel group or some form of group that is fighting against the central government. So if a group in Canada were to fight against the Canadian government, that would count as a civil war. A regional internal war would be a war between a regional government and a non-state actor. So in this case, again, it's against a government, but it's a regional government and a non-state actor. So in the Canadian context, again, we would think of a non-state actor fighting against, say, the Quebec government. That would count as a regional internal war. So they're not fighting necessarily against the entire state, but against the government of a particular region. And then finally, intercommunal wars, which are wars between two or more non-state actors within the state. So here, governments aren't involved at all, or at least as primary actors. It's two different rebel groups, say, within a particular state, or within a particular region with the state, are fighting each other for control over land, resources, whatever it might be. So government's not involved as a primary combatant. So we're going to go a little bit deeper on civil wars themselves for the rest of the class, but do remember that there are regional internal wars and intercommunal wars. When we talk about the Syrian civil war next time, we'll see that it does have some elements of civil war, but it also has some elements of intercommunal war going on, and then we'll also see some also non-interstate war elements as well. Some of the ones that we would have talked about in past lectures, making it even more complicated. So how do we define a civil war, kind of more specifically, more deeply? So we could define it as a war between factions within a state trying to create or prevent a new government for the entire state or some territorial part of it. The aim may be to be changed. The aim may be to change the entire system of government, to merely replace the people in it, or to split a region off as a new state, right? So it's against, remember, the central government. So it could be to create an entire new system. So if it's a particular form of government, it's to overthrow and change the entire system of government. It may just be that so it could be, for example, a civil war to topple an authoritarian government, a non-democratic government, and install democracy. Right? So you could have a civil war to change the entire system of government. It could be a war to replace the people in the government, so not change the system. So you have a non-democratic government. There's a civil war to overthrow the government and put in new leaders, but still non-democratic leaders. So not change the system, just change who's in charge of it. Or it could be to split off a region off as a new state. So if there's one region that wants to secede and they're fighting against the central government to be able to have the ability to be able to secede from the central state, to create their own government or their own country in their region, or at least sometimes it may not even be to split off completely, but it may be to at least gain greater autonomy, greater control over what happens within that particular region. How do we measure civil wars? So it's actually quite similar to how we would measure interstate wars, which we saw in the past. So it involves fighting between agents of or claimants to a state and organized non-state groups who sought either to take control of a government, to take power in a region, or to use violence to change government. So it's got to involve fighting between members of the government or those who are representing or fighting for the government and against non-state groups who are seeking to make the changes that we've talked about on the previous slide. The conflict must kill at least 1,000 over its course with a yearly average of at least 100. So this is similar to the 1,000 battle death side that we saw, or 1,000 battle deaths requirement that we saw when we were defining interstate war. And at least 100 were killed on both sides, including civilians attacked by rebels. So this is just to make sure that it's not one side slaughtering another side uniquely, in which case we won't really be calling it a war. We could be giving it some other definition, but it's got to involve at least some level of kind of combat capabilities from both sides. Now, again, you can agree or disagree with this definition. You can agree or disagree with the 1,000 battle deaths, see at least 100 killed. There is an arbitrariness to this, but they're also testable, right? You could, if you wanted to be testing a theory of civil wars, you could change and say, instead of 1,000 battle deaths over its course, it's 500. If we change it to 500, or if we change it to 2,000, does that make a substantive difference? So these are things that we can test for, but the idea is, again, to make it sufficiently large so that's not just a skirmish, you know, a rebel shot and killed a member of government, you know, that person, that rebel who shot the member of government may have goal of overthrowing the government, right? But we're not going to call that a civil war. It's too small scale. So we have to have some threshold that we want to meet. So why do we talk about civil war? So up until the end of the Cold War, civil wars didn't take as much, or weren't as important in the study of international relations. Not to say that civil wars didn't happen, but because of the magnitude of the Cold War, they were kind of viewed as secondary importance, or they weren't a primary focus of a lot of international relations study. Since the end of the Cold War, civil wars have taken on a greater role, or more prominence within the study of international relations. And some of that can be explained by some of the statistics that we can see when it comes to civil wars. And so these are a little bit old, ending in 1999, but it'll show the pattern that we want to be seeing for why we see the change after the Cold War, and why civil wars are an important focus for understanding international relations, right? So from 1945 to 1999, so the Cold War period, and then kind of the first 10 years afterwards, there were 3.33 million deaths from interstate wars. So that's a lot of deaths, and so understanding interstate wars is certainly very important. But there were 16.2 million deaths from civil wars. So a much larger number of people were killed from civil wars, meaning that understanding civil wars would certainly be important. What about the duration of civil wars? Well, for an interstate war, the median duration of 3 months. So on average, interstate wars last about 3 months, so not terribly long. Civil wars, on the other hand, the median duration is 6 years. So they kill a lot more people, and they typically last a lot longer. And then what about the frequency and how many states are involved? So again, over the same time period, there were 25 different states involved in 25 interstate wars during that time period. When it comes to civil wars, though, there were 73 states involved in 127 civil wars. So there was a lot larger number of civil wars that existed compared to interstate wars, involved larger number of states, it killed more people, and on average, they lasted longer. So that certainly suggests that understanding civil wars are an important concept and important topic in international relations. So how frequent are civil wars? So we could see that over the time period, it remains relatively stable. So we see a lot of major civil wars and minor civil wars holding relatively stable from 1990 to 2013 to kind of see, is this a continuing trend? Are we seeing improvements or not? So civil wars continue to be an important problem. So here are some civil war myths. So these myths are based on kind of common expectations about civil wars, and it turns out that they largely are myths. So one of the arguments that often gets made is that when the Cold War ended, civil wars emerged at that point. So there weren't many civil wars before the end of the Cold War. And then at the end of the Cold War, when the superpower conflict ended, civil wars emerged during that time period. It turns out that's not true. That's not the pattern we see. Another argument we see for civil wars is that where you have either ethnic and or religious diversity, you'll have more civil wars. It also turns out that that's not true. And then finally, there is always the belief that civil wars are less likely in democracies. And that's also not true. That's not the case. So we're going to look at each of these myths in turn to see what actually is true in each of these cases. So end of the Cold War and Civil War. So here, if we look, we've got from 1945 up to 1999. And so the argument that's traditionally made is that there was a low number of civil wars before 1990, and then there was a giant spike in 1990. And usually the argument goes that it was because during the Cold War period, the superpowers controlled most of the world. And whenever kind of states who were allies with the US or with the Soviet Union, whenever there was the possibility of a civil war breaking out, kind of the superpowers would kind of prevent it or tell them no or to cut it out because they didn't want to kind of destabilize the alliance. So they kind of kept control over all these different countries. When the superpower conflict ends, then there's the opportunity to settle scores. There's no longer anyone who's kind of preventing from these wars from happening. So all kinds of ancient hatreds kind of could come forward. But if we look kind of at the trends, we see a general upward trajectory from 1945 to 1990. It does seem a little bit steeper in the immediate breakdown of 1990, but then it kind of comes back to trend. So there's a little bit of a peak. So there was a little bit of an increase right around the end of the Cold War, but then it quickly flattened out and kind of returned to normal. If anything, we then see a decrease afterwards in kind of those later years. So the pattern that we typically see here, while again, there was a slight increase in around 1990, it still fits the general pattern of increasing number of civil wars over time. Yeah, so in the 1999 level of 25 ongoing civil wars had already been reached by the mid-1980s. So showing, yes, there was a brief increase, but then it shot right back down. Conflicts associated with Soviet collapse were partly responsible for the sharp increase in the 1990s. So as the Soviet Union did break apart, there was an emergence more locally in former, say, Soviet republics or in close allies to the Soviet Union. There were some civil wars that did break out. So that would be partly responsible for the sharp increase in the early 1990s, but a marked decline has followed since, kind of returning back to normal. So what seems to be the explanation for the continual rise in civil wars? Well, it turns out that the rate of outbreak, there's 2.31 civil wars per year breakout since 1945. Now, there's some years where it's much higher and some years where it's much lower, but in general, it's about 2.31 breakout every year and about 1.85 end per year. So whenever you have more civil wars starting than you have ending, you're going to see an increase in civil wars. So the increase isn't due to collapse of Soviet Union or the end of Cold War. It just turns out that since 1945, more civil wars start each year than end. Partially because they're long-lasting, partially because there's quite a few of them. If you saw the number of states involved and the number of total of them, there's quite a lot of them and they last a long time. This explains kind of the general upward trend. In terms of ethnic diversity in civil war, so multiple studies report that ethnic diversity and income inequality are not correlated with civil war. Conflicts in ethnically diverse countries may be ethnically patterned without being ethnically caused. right? So you can have a conflict that ends up taking on ethnic dimensions later, either because groups end up dividing based on ethnicity, because leaders try to stimulate support among co-ethnics, but the cause of the Civil War isn't due to ethnicity, so it's not due to some ethnic hatreds. So we don't see that states that are more ethnically diverse, we don't see more civil wars than we find in ethnically homogenous states or religiously homogenous states. So the likelihood of civil war breakout doesn't depend on the ethnic diversity. And one of the reasons that we typically view for, or typical argument we have for why you'd see increased civil wars in ethnically diverse states is kind of the idea of ethnic hatred or long-lasting hatreds between peoples. So a particular group has just a long-standing hatred with another group in the state, and so that makes be due to this long history of sometimes pointing back centuries. When you hear kind of stories about why we should expect civil wars in a particular country, it'll be pointed to, you know, events that happened in the 14th century, and these two groups have hated each other for that long, ever since that event in the 14th century. When we look at the cause of the Civil War, what turns out to matter more is what's happened in recent history, what's currently going on at the time of the outbreak of the war, not what's happened centuries ago. If a country recently experienced a civil war, it's much more likely to have another one. The risk fades the longer peace endures. So if you've had groups that haven't liked each other for a really long time, but they've been at peace with each other for quite a long time, the risk of a civil war isn't any higher than in other states. What really matters is what's happened recently and not these ancient histories. So that's kind of an overblown rationale that's given for civil wars that doesn't really seem to be borne out by the evidence. Regime type is kind of related to the third myth. So the idea behind why we expect democracy to be less associated with civil war is the idea that civil wars are responses to grievances. In a non-democracy, if you've got a grievance against a government, you have limited ways, limited recourses to be able to change the policy, to be able to participate in the political process and make changes, because they're closed systems that aren't particularly responsive to the views of others. So in this case, in a non-democracy, if you've got a grievance, because you have limited options. If it's an important enough grievance for you, your only recourse may be to engage in a civil war. In a democracy, because there's more opportunities to participate in the political process, your argument goes that if you've got a grievance, you've got a number of different objects that you are options that you can select before choosing a civil war, and many of these options are less costly and may have higher chances of success. Prospects of succeeding in civil war are typically quite low, and the costs are quite high. So many of these other options are more enticing. Now, it still could be in a democracy that you go through all the different regular methods or nonviolent methods of political participation. You still fail to have your voice heard or to affect change. The issue or the grievance is significant enough that you decide that after exhausting all of these other options, you'll proceed to civil war. That's still a possibility even within democracy, but because of the greater opportunities available for participation in the political process, many civil wars should be avoidable. However, the evidence, when we look at incidents of civil war, we find that democratic countries are no less likely to experience civil wars than authoritarian countries. So despite the extra abilities to be able to participate in the political process, it doesn't seem at the end of the day to make democratic countries less likely to experience civil wars than non-democratic countries. So what does seem to explain then the emergence of civil wars? So one of the primary explanations for the emergence of civil war turns out to be whether an insurgency is possible. And an insurgency is a technology of military conflict characterized by small, lightly armed bands practicing guerrilla warfare from rural base areas. So irregular warfare So guerrilla warfare, where you launch an attack, say, from villages, you're not fighting conventional battles, conventional pitched battles on the warfare or on the battlefield. Usually launch from rural base areas. So you kind of have strongholds in rural areas, and you bring to bear the weapons that you can, which are often much smaller or lighter than what conventional armies would be fighting, and you fight guerrilla style warfare. So hit and run tactics, ambushes, and combat of that form. And multiple studies have found that conditions associated with insurgencies are also associated with civil wars. So it's not regime type, it's not income inequality, it's not ethnic diversity that predicts civil war, but it's the ability to be able to carry out an insurgency. Because if you're able to carry out an insurgency, then you've got a prospect for being able to have a successful civil war. If you don't have the conditions favorable for carrying out an insurgency, then your prospect of carrying out a successful civil war aren't very high. So if you want to take kind of two different states that have similar sized grievances against the central government, and you want to figure out which ones are likely to experience a civil war versus which ones are not likely to experience a civil war. If you look at the ones that are likely to have the conditions that are favorable for an insurgency, those are the ones that you would be more likely to experience a civil war. So in terms of why is insurgency important for a civil war? So we still have to remember, whenever we're talking about a civil war, despite how common they are, they're very difficult for non-state actors to win, because no matter how weak the state is, insurgents are weak compared to the government. Government has a lot more resources than pretty much any non-state actor could accumulate, right? Because they have control of the military, they have control of the state apparatus, they have control over the police forces, the intelligence apparatuses, the economy, they've got the power of taxation, they may have external allies. So even when we're talking about weak states, they're still traditionally stronger than any non-state actor could be. There may be some counterexamples of particularly weak states and strong non-state actors that emerge, but typically this will be the case, right? So in any confrontation, in any civil war, given that the state is almost necessarily going to be stronger, if you want to have any realistic prospect of being successful, and if you have no prospect of being successful, then selecting civil war is not a good option. You need the ability to be able to, you need conditions that allow you to possibly win despite your relative weakness. And so an insurgency, the ability to carry out an insurgency, gives you this ability. So what conditions allow insurgents to, conditions that allow insurgents to hide increase the likelihood of a successful insurgency. So one of the conditions for successful insurgency is the ability to be able to hide. So for example, you're able to carry out a strike against the government forces and then go hide before they're able to retaliate against you. So you come in, you do their strike, and then you're able to go back and disappear into either local communities or into an inaccessible region. So conditions that favor the ability to hide include things like rough terrain, poorly served by roads, at a distance from centers of state power, should favor insurgency and civil war. So if it's a remote region, particularly one with rough terrain that's difficult to access, and particularly if there's not a strong, good road networks in that area, and if it's far from military bases or centers of the government power, these favor groups being able to hide and not be able to be accessed by government. So if you think of Taliban fighters, for example, in Afghanistan, or Al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan who were able to hide in mountainous terrain. There was poor road access for government troops to be able to come, or for coalition troops to be able to find them. It was terrain was very inaccessible, and there was many places for them to hide. Availability of foreign cross-border sanctuaries. So if you're able to carry out a hit on government forces and then retreat across the state boundary into another country, the military likely won't be able to follow you across state boundaries, or else they risk starting an interstate war against the other country. And now sometimes civil wars can lead to interstate wars, but oftentimes the government forces won't be able to follow across state boundaries. And availability of a local population that can be induced not to denounce the insurgents to the government agents. So if you've got a friendly local population who will help hide you. So for example, if you carry out attacks on government forces, you come back to the village to hide, but members of the community don't like you, and so they inform police forces or military forces who are members of the guerrilla group. Well, then it's going to be easy for them to identify. If the village hides who are members of the group, then the government's not likely to be able to gain information, and so insurgents will better be able to hide. To survive, rebels need arms and material, money to buy them, or smugglable goods to trade for them. They need a supply of recruits to the insurgent way of life, and they may need information, instructions, and practical details of running an insurgency. So in this case, they need either to be in a region where there's goods that they're able to export to gain resources, or they need friends abroad who are able to supply them with money or material. They need a supply of recruits, so they need enough people in the regions where they're recruiting or in the country who are sympathetic with the cause and willing to join the fight. And they may need information, instruction in practical details of running an insurgency. So often, again, this will be a patron from either groups outside of the country or from foreign countries, or willing to provide training to members of the insurgency. These are all, if you've got availability of these different characteristics, and it's more likely that you'll be able to have a successful insurgency. Most important for the prospect of a nascent insurgency, however, are the government's police and military capabilities and the reach of government institutions into rural areas. Insurgents are better able to survive and prosper if the government and military they oppose are relatively weak, badly financed, organizationally inept, corrupt, politically divided, and poorly informed about going on at the local level. So the stronger the state capacity is, the more it can overcome any of these different elements. So for example, if the state has a strong military, even if you're able to recruit insurgents and receive outside training and outside material, the government's military forces are still likely to be much stronger. Even if there's rural areas that are far from the center of the government, a highly capable government will have strong road networks, strong ability to control all of the territory. So even the more rural, further out territory will still be accessible. Stronger governments will also have strong police and intelligence apparatus that they're able to use to find out who are members of the insurgents or to buy off informants. So all of these different characteristics of state capacity, if you have a highly capable state, it's even with these other conditions in place, it's very unlikely that insurgency would be able to survive. So if you take like an advanced state, say like Canada, right, or the United States, it'd be very difficult to launch an insurgency. Yes, in Canada and the US, there are rural areas where insurgents may be able to hide, particularly in Canada where there's vast areas where there's very little kind of government presence. But the state has sufficient capacity that even with remote areas, even if there was ability to gain material, to be able to gain enough recruits, enough material to be able to go up against the Canadian forces and be victorious, or to be able to hide in a place where the Canadian forces would not have access, isn't a particularly likely scenario, no matter how strong the insurgent group were. The Canadian government is likely to be stronger and by a considerable margin. If you're dealing with a weaker state, then yes, it's possible that there are entire regions of the country where they don't really have access. It's possible if you get a large enough recruitment base with strong enough material and strong enough training, that the training will be better than what the army has, and that you could come up with forces that are still smaller, but that are able to launch a strong battle. And this is particularly the case if you've got also kind of inept or poor institutions or corrupt institutions where the government's ability to even be able to control their forces or organize their forces may be limited. So they may have greater military strength, but if they can't organize that military strength, then there's still an element of weakness. So related to this, then, one of the factors that is correlated with civil wars is per capita income. And the reason that higher per capita income as opposed to income inequality is a proxy for grievances often. But we've seen that it's not grievances per se, but it's insurgency, the ability for insurgency that predicts civil wars. And higher per capita income is a proxy for states' overall financial, administrative, police, and military capability. So all else being equal, a state that's got higher per capita income will have a greater tax base, greater resources, and so it'll have the ability to have strong administration, strong reach into different regions, strong police forces, and strong military capabilities. So richer countries are less likely to experience civil war. It will mark more developed countries with terrain more disciplined by roads and rural society more penetrated by central administration, right? So it's unlikely in a wealthier country that there's going to be any regions where the government doesn't have access. So there'll be a strong road network throughout the country, including rural areas, and there'll be there'll be no areas where the central government doesn't have some form of presence, including administration, so for taxation, but also things like police and intelligence presences for gaining information about the local community. Recruiting young men or women to the life of a guerrilla is easier when the economic alternatives are worse. So also higher per capita income, the stronger the economy is, the more other opportunities there are for recruits. So imagine if you're a potential recruit for a guerrilla organization, and imagine how you would consider your options in the following two scenarios. So first scenario, high per capita income. So your choices are between earning a decently high paying job or fighting in a civil war with a lower pay and a high risk of death. Even if you don't like the central government and you've got these two options, which one do you think most people are likely to take? Well, many people are going to take the secure, decently well-paying job. Now consider a country with a lower per capita income and your choices, and say high unemployment. And your choices are between unemployment or very low income, or participating in a guerrilla or an insurgency, a guerrilla group participating in insurgency, where there's some financial backing, so your family will be provided for, and you've got the chance of changing the government. So settling your grievances and potentially getting a better life for you. Which of the options then becomes more appealing? Well, you could see more people if there's no other possibility for economic opportunity outside of the guerrilla organization choosing to participate in the insurgency. And it turns out that income has a dramatic effect. So $1,000 less in per capita income, so income per person, is associated with a 41% greater annual odds of civil war onset on average. And so that's an enormous jump, given that $1,000 in per capita income, particularly in wealthier countries, is a particularly large income. Now, in poorer countries, $1,000 per capita income change is a huge difference. In countries where per capita income may be, 5,000, 6,000, or 2,000 or 1,000, if it's per capita income is 1,000, $1,000 increase per capita is a doubling. But in a richer country, it may not seem as important. But that's still, for every 1,000, is a massive change in the annual odds of civil war onset. Holding other variables at their median values, a country in the 10th percentile on income, so 90% of countries are wealthier or have higher income per capita, and 10% have lower, has an 18% chance of a civil war outbreak over a decade. compared to 11% chance for a country at the median income. So 50% are richer, 50% are poor, 1 in 10 over a decade in that case, and a 1% chance for a country at the 90th percentile. So 10% are richer, 9% are poor, right? So we go from about a 20% chance over a decade to about a 10% chance to about a 1% chance. So 1 in 5 to 1 in 10, about 1 in 5, just under 1 in 5, to just over 1 in 10 to 1 in 100. So it makes a dramatic difference income in terms of likelihood of onset to civil war. And then finally, related to kind of resources and being able to fund civil wars. So we've talked about kind of the importance of income for the central government. There's also the importance of, we talked about income also for rebel groups. And so one measure related to the economy that could be important in civil war onset is primary commodity exports. So conflicts also more likely in countries that depend heavily on natural resources for their export earnings, in part because rebel groups can extort their gains from the trade to finance their operations, right? So if they're able to gain some control over regions that control these resources, where resources are located, they may be able to gain the revenue from those primary resources themselves and use those to fund their operation. Where in a service economy, this is less likely to be possible, but in a primary commodity where you're exporting oil, minerals, lumber, this is something that if you control the region, the rural region, then you're able to possibly extract those resources. Natural resources can also fuel secessionist desires if a particularly valuable natural resource is located within a particular region. That region may desire to secede so that it doesn't have to share the gains from that resource. So imagine if oil is discovered in a region of a country. The oil wealth would normally have to be spread across all members of the country. Those in that local region may say, hey, now we've got this wealth, we don't have to depend on the central government. In fact, now we would be sending a whole bunch of wealth to the central government and only very little of it would be coming back to us. So say the region had 1 million people and the country has 10 million people, right? So if they seceded, then the wealth would be shared just among the 1 million people in that region. If they don't secede, then the wealth is shared among the full 10 million people, so they'll only get 1/10 as much of the resources or the wealth from it as they would if they seceded. So it could give them a greater incentive to believe that they could be a full functioning state because of this element of their economy, but also a desire not to share this resource with others. So these are many of the factors that can produce an increased likelihood of civil war. Next time, we're going to look at the Syrian conflict to see just how complicated it is. What are the different types of conflict that we see mixed in from the different ones that we've seen today related to intrastate conflicts, but also some of the other categories that we saw last time, and take a look kind of more at the origins as opposed to the conclusion, just seeing the complexity of the issue and why it has posed so difficult to be able to resolve. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week.